Building on what we learned in the 5S module, we'll now talk more about standards, understanding what they are, how useful they can be, and practically how to apply them. Before we begin, we'll be recovering the topic of Mura, something really important to cover when talking standards. So let's dive straight in. Before we go on, I want to revisit an example we have previously looked at that I think explains the effect of variation really well. This is the traffic jam example. You've likely all been on a motorway before, where you're stuck in traffic, waiting to get to the front of the traffic jam and expecting to see the cause, either an accident or roadworks. You get to the front and the traffic jam just clears. These are known as phantom traffic jams and are caused by variation. Variations in speed causes cars to slow down and speed up, creating a knock-on effect to all the cars behind it. The effect amplifies as more cars add to the problem and a long queue of traffic with long waiting times is formed. You may have also noticed that it is much more likely at busy times. This is because as the amount of cars on the road increases, there is less room for corrective behaviour, and any variation has an immediate impact on the traffic behind. The same way variation in speed causes traffic and queues on the road, in organisations, variation causes queues to build up. In a production environment, this could be WIP and inventory, and in service environments, this could be queues of people or work. Either way, we want to avoid this as much as possible. So let's dive a little deeper and look at a scientific equation that demonstrates the impact that variation has on queues and therefore waiting time. Now don't worry if this looks a little intimidating. The application of this formula itself is not important, and you'll never be tested on how to use it. However, understanding the impact that each variable has on waiting time is really important and needs to be understood. The Kingsman Equation outlines how there are three critical variables that contribute to waiting time. Firstly is arrival variation, secondly is process variation, and thirdly is utilization. The arrival variation is the variation in the time between arrival of your item or person. The process time variation is the variation in how long the process itself takes, and the utilization is how much of your resource is being used. Thinking back to the traffic example, this would be how many cars are on the road. As variation in either arrival time or process time increases, waiting time increases exponentially. The same can be said for utilization. With a given variation, as you increase utilization, your waiting time would again increase exponentially. Let's break this down. Firstly, a process that has zero arrival variation, zero process variation, and utilization not above 100% will have a queue of 0 with no waiting time. That would be a dream come true and an example of perfect flow. Just imagine this at bank. Each customer arrives exactly 1 minute apart, i.e. no arrival variation. Each process takes exactly 1 minute, i.e. no process variation, and the utilization of the bank clerk is 100%, i.e. they're always busy adding value. In reality, this never happens. People don't always arrive exactly the same time apart, which would be with zero arrival time variation. If you think of a supermarket or bank, there are busy periods and there are quiet periods, where there is significant arrival time variation. As arrival time variation increases, waiting increases exponentially. Process time also has variation. Mistakes are made, people want different things, work at different speeds and in different ways. You can think of like when you go to the shop and one person has a large amount of shopping in front of you, causing the process of scanning to take longer and leading to the build-up of a queue. As with arrival time variation, as process time variation increases, the waiting time also increases exponentially. Finally, we have to take into account utilization. Arrival time variation and or process time variation do not lead to long queues when the utilization of the checkouts operator is low. For example, if all checkout operators are only utilized to 20% of their capacity, meaning they are only busy 20% of the time and idle 80% of the time, then even if there is variation in arrival times and process times, the queues will likely remain very small. Look at the green line to demonstrate this. At low levels of variation, the waiting time is almost non-existent, and even at high levels of variation, queues are only just starting to form, with little waiting time. However, when there are peak periods or rush hours, the utilization of operators starts to increase and reaches levels above 70%. In other words, the checkout operator is idle less than 30% of the time. This can be shown with the red line. Again, with very low levels of variation, the impact on waiting time is not significant, but as soon as variation increases, the waiting time soon spirals out of control and shoots up. If you now follow the blue line on the graph, you can see that at different utilization levels, the waiting time increases greater and greater. At 95% utilization, the waiting time is very high, and at 100% utilization, the waiting time would tend to infinity. I know that this graph may seem confusing, but you just need to know that waiting times are a function of arrival and process variation, as well as utilization. In order to control waiting times, you need to reduce variation as much as possible and ensure utilization doesn't get too high. So we've talked a lot about variation in banks and supermarkets, but what does this mean in a production environment? Well, in a production environment, the item we're looking at will be the product flowing through our system. The arrival time will be the time a product arrives at our process, and the process time is how long the processes take. The utilization will be that of the machine or operator. The waiting time in this scenario would be the items before the process, queuing and waiting to be worked on, i.e. WIP or inventory. So why is it important? And now that we know the effect of variation and utilization on waiting time, how can we control it? Well, firstly, it is important to control these factors because they all hinder flow. In the supermarket, this is the flow of customers and directly relates to the quality of their service. If we can reduce waiting times and queues, customers will be much happier with the faster, better service they receive, returning to the shop in the future. In a production environment, these queues would be products. If we can manipulate the utilization and variation, we can improve the flow, reduce the lead time, and minimize the waste of waiting. The same could be said with work orders or any entity moving through a service environment. Managing queues and waiting times are extremely important. So what can we do to help control these variables? Starting by looking at arrival variation. In a production environment, you have the unique ability to set your arrival variation. If you produce to tact and ensure good flow through your system, you can have the material or product arriving at your process at exact time intervals, thus controlling the arrival variation. That is the beauty of tact, artificially spreading the arrival variation throughout the day into regular time intervals. This is much more difficult when the queuing is of people, like at a supermarket or at a bank. You could ensure everyone schedules appointments for their visit, which would allow you to structure the arrival times and reduce variation. However, I'm not sure how many people would be happy booking an appointment to go to the shop to buy a sandwich. This is, however, done in places like hospitals and other service-based environments for exactly this reason. Next, let's talk about utilization. Now, this is something that you can easily control. You can employ more people or buy more equipment to increase your resource and decrease your utilization, which would in turn reduce your waiting time. This, however, does incur a cost, the cost of extra resource and equipment, which, while not being used, will have the waste of waiting. The efficient and lean way would be to focus on having very little variation allowing you to keep utilisation levels relatively high and in turn keeping queues short, waiting time low, and minimising the waste of waiting for staff or machines. This brings us on to process time variation. Processes often involve people, and people naturally work at different speeds and in different ways. This is where standards come in. Standards create a uniform, single way of doing a process, the best way. This means following the same steps, in the same order, in the same way, and taking the same amount of time. Meaning they're an incredibly powerful tool in reducing process time variation. They can be applied to supermarket checkout staff, production processes, or even hospital appointments, and in all these cases will help reduce waiting times and queues. So let's quickly go back to the Kingsman equation. There are 3 variables that affect waiting time. In order to reduce waiting time, you want to reduce arrival variation, which can be done through scheduling and tact, and you want to control utilisation to ensure it doesn't get above 80% and amplify the problem. And finally, you want to minimise process variation through the implementation of standards and standard work. So let's focus on standards. If we cast our minds back to Module 2, which was the history of Lean, remember Fred Winslow Taylor, one of the creators of mass production? He defined standards as being the one best way, with available technology, to do any task that will minimise time and effort and maximise safety, quality and productivity. This definition of a standard remains valid today, but we have slightly changed it to address the impact that standards have on reducing process variation, as this is also an extremely important element. Fred Winslow Taylor formed a new type of management called scientific management, breaking down work into a sequence of operations with the belief that there is one best way of doing something. The same way that there is one tallest mountain on Earth, there is only one best way of doing something. There are many other ways of doing it, but they're not as good. Another important part of this definition is the emphasis on available technology, implying that there will be newer, better ways of working that evolve, helping to stress the point that standards are dynamic things and should never become static. So what practically is a standard? Well, a standard is just a document that explains the tasks needed to complete a certain action. For example, you could write a standard for how to tie your shoelaces, which would explain step by step how to do it. A standard should always explain the best way of doing something. By that I mean the fastest, safest, and with the best end result. There are many types of standard. Standard work, standardized work, standard operating procedures, etc. Ultimately, they're all referring to the same common theme. Standards are just a formalized way to document how a process should be completed. The important thing with standards is that if not created, you cannot identify when a problem or error has occurred, and there is no way of comparing what has happened with what should have happened. If you think of a standard as being the blue dashed cube on the screen, once the standard itself has been created, the processes within the standard will start to follow the same sequence with little to no variation. Without that cube, i.e. the standard being there, you wouldn't be able to spot any problems or different ways of working, as there would be no reference to compare against. With the standards in place, the incorrect processes, i.e. the red arrows, become clear that they are not following the correct procedure and are out of standard. That is the most basic and fundamental benefit of creating standards, making problems and abnormalities with processes visible. Now we know what standards are, let's look more at why we create them. We will then look at how to create them and some real-world examples of good and bad standards. As shown with the Kingsman equation, by using standards to reduce process variation, the waste of waiting is reduced and planning becomes much easier. As standards outline the best way to do a process, best practices are communicated between operators, knowledge is shared, and productivity is increased. Standards create processes and procedures that are highly repeatable, reliable, and capable. With this in mind, they help embed quality into the process. Since everyone is now working the same way, errors relating to the way the process is conducted can be eliminated. By controlling processes to be the same each time, you'll get consistent results, embedding quality into the process. In Japan, standards are placed by every workstation, but not facing the operator to help guide them through the process, instead facing the walkway for the quality managers or team leaders to read, checking the standard is being adhered to. This is not by any means to catch the operator out. The operator should be practically trained by an expert in the process, without the need to refer back to the standard itself. By directly comparing the standard with the way the process is really being carried out, deviations can be identified and questioned. Perhaps an operator has found a better way of doing something, or the current standard causes overburden on the operator. Either way, by directly comparing the standard with what really happens, quality becomes ingrained in the process and a culture of continuous improvement is reinforced. Standards form the basis for improvement and are often seen as the foundation for quality. By this I mean, even if there is a standard way of working and everyone follows it, it is less important that the standard is really the best way of doing something. It is more important that everyone is following it and it is regularly improved and updated. A standard should not be there to catch operators out. It should be there to help generate and communicate improvements. Without standards in place, improvements are lost. Standards act as a wedge to ensure improvements are documented, communicated and realised. They can then be improved on once they have been created. Another huge benefit of standards is that with them there, work content can be broken down into sub-elements or parts of the process. This has one enormous benefit: flexibility. Let's imagine the tack time is 45 seconds, and this process has a cycle time of 80 seconds. Well, we have a problem. The process cannot keep up with the customer demand, the tact. Because each step of the process has been documented and broken down into its 9 sub-elements, and the time for each carefully recorded, when we want to distribute work between people and balance the work content between them, we can easily do so now. Now that the work content has been clearly split between the two operators, they both have a cycle time faster than the tack time. Without creating standards, people would work in different ways and you wouldn't have a defined sequence of tasks, meaning you wouldn't be able to split the work in this way. The final benefit of standards is their ability to be used as part of training for new starters. To summarise the benefits of standards, they reduce variation and produce stable processes with little waiting time. They increase productivity by sharing knowledge and best practices. They help embed quality into the process. They enable problems to become visible. They form the basis for improvement. And they allow the easy delegation of tasks and increase operator flexibility. And finally, they can be used with training for new starters. So let's now look at an example that visually demonstrates the benefits of standards in a more simple way. Let's imagine an improvement workshop has been held at the Gemba involving all the team members. The aim of the workshop was communicated, and a competition kicked off to see who could complete the process in the fastest but best possible way, explaining that safety and quality cannot be sacrificed, but the operators can work in any way they want to. The time taken by each operator was recorded, and the results were plotted on a graph like this, a bar chart. As you can see, operator 4 was the fastest, with a time of 40 seconds, and the variation between operators, the process variation, was 25 seconds. Operator 4 is now asked to repeat the same process, but this time purposely slowed down, explaining what he is doing in each step. This allows other operators to question each step and see whether they have a better way of doing it. Now that all the operators have discussed their individual tips and best practices, It has been found that a combination of different methods from operator 4, 5 and 8 will create the best overall standard. The new standard is created, documented and tested with the operators and takes only 30 seconds to complete. There is a big improvement in productivity. As you can see, there are still small differences in the time that people take, and the process variation hasn't been eliminated. It has been reduced to 5 seconds. This allows planning to be much more reliable now. By training the new standards, the increase in productivity accumulates to make a big impact. Also, the team feels engaged and empowered to suggest further improvements should they discover any in the future. There are standards everywhere, in all walks of life and industries. Chefs and bakers follow very precise standards in the form of recipes. They go step by step through the process, using the same ingredients, controlling the time, the temperature and the techniques. They know that in order to get consistent results, you have to follow the same standard. Michelin-starred restaurants use visual standards when plating a dish to ensure the appearance of each dish is identical and the quality remains consistent for all customers. Fast food chains and franchises use standards for the same reasons, maintaining consistency between different restaurants with different staff and across different countries. Remember when I said that standards enable problems to become visible? Imagine if McDonald's hadn't created standards outlining how to create a Big Mac. There would be no way of distinguishing the right way to create one, with the right ingredients and correct appearance, against the wrong way to make one. Customers would get completely different products depending on what restaurant they visited, and no problem would be identified until the standard has been created. Let's compare two standards to identify what makes a standard good and bad. From first glance, what standard do you think is the good one, and which one do you think is the bad one? The good one is the one on the right, and the one on the left is the bad one. The reason why is because a good standard needs to satisfy 5 requirements. They need to be simple, unique, accessible, visual, and clear. Simple, as not to confuse people. Unique to the process that they are explaining. Accessible, i.e. at or near to the point of use, not stored in a desk or folder. Visual, maximising the power of visual management that we have discussed before, for example using colours, pictures and diagrams. And clear, without misunderstanding and ambiguity. Now you know the benefits of standards, why they're so important, some examples, and the 5 criteria of a good standard. I'll finish with some advice that will become useful when putting standards into place. One of the biggest mistakes when creating a standard is not involving the team. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but the people at the front line know their job better than anyone else. Standards are the sum of all the best ways discovered, up to the present, to complete a process. It makes perfect sense to involve the people that do the processes on a daily basis. Not only as they are best suited, they will often want to learn of any improvements in the way they work themselves. If you create standards in isolation, i.e. away from the Gemba, I can guarantee that the people they are intended for will not use them. They will feel very much imposed, and as a way of controlling them and taking away their skill or independence. Creating and imposing standards in isolation is one of the best single-handed ways to disengage people from the lean journey, and couldn't be further from the people involvement aspect of lean that is so important. Remember the Kaizen approach we discussed, a top-down command and control approach where management delegates solutions should be switched with the bottom-up challenge and support structure where the aim is to coach and develop staff. Another point to address is how people often perceive standards. People think standards mean rigid, repetitive or boring work that mimics the classic mass production as mentioned in the History of Lean module. Standards that are used to track performance or crack the whip completely miss the point of lean. Standards are created, owned and updated by operators as a means to continuously improve and innovate the way they work. Let me re-emphasize that they are owned by the operators. Without standards, workers have no basis to enable improvements to be made and communicated. When applied correctly, standards can stimulate people involvement and be used as a tool to help empower operators and have their opinions and voices heard. If you think of a master training their apprentice, how do they do this? Well, they involve the apprentice, who shadows them, writes down any tips, important steps of the process, timings, etc. In essence, an apprentice is informally writing standards without knowing it. So why not formalise this process and create high quality standards that aim in training and sharing the knowledge? My final point before we summarise what we have learnt today is that a benefit of standards that is often overestimated is the increase in speed of training. Standards are in place to document the current best way of doing a task. They should, however, not be used solely as the training method for new starters. The essence of lean and continuous improvement is about involving people. How involved does someone feel if you give them a standard operating procedure to sign and then expect them to be able to complete the job? Standards should be used briefly in training to ensure nothing has been missed, but people should be trained practically, learning by doing. Almost all companies have standards to some extent, but what we are really looking for is the forming of habits. Firstly, the habit of following and using the standards, and secondly, the continuous improvement habits we have discussed in the Kaizen module. Standards should not become stagnant. They should always be improving with innovations, new technology, or simply by experimentation. There is a big difference between having standards and following and using standards. Having standards doesn't mean standard work, with all the benefits that we have discussed. It will be painful and it will take time, but you have to actually follow the standards. Otherwise, you're not achieving standard work and you're not going to get the results. So let's recap the 7 benefits of standards. They reduce variation, they improve productivity, they embed quality into the process and allow problems to become visible. They form the basis for improvement. They allow operator flexibility. And finally, they help with the training process. A good standard should have 5 characteristics. It should be clear, visual, unique, accessible, and simple. In the next module, we'll be talking about OEE, Overall Equipment Effectiveness. So please grab yourself a pen and paper. This is going to be a very hands-on, practical module.